"Sir, don't drink that coffee." Naomi Brooks' voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet it sliced through the polished silence of the executive boardroom with the precision of a fire alarm in the middle of the night. Every conversation stopped. Every expensive pen froze above leather portfolios. 12 executives turned their heads almost in perfect unison, their expressions shifting from mild annoyance to open disbelief as they searched for the source of the interruption. At the far end of the 40-foot walnut conference table, Richard Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Global Industries, paused with a steaming porcelain cup only inches from his lips. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 52nd floor, painting silver reflections across the skyline of downtown Chicago, but inside the room the warmth seemed to disappear all at once. Richard lowered the cup just enough to study the woman standing near the service station. Naomi wore the same Navy housekeeping uniform she'd worn every weekday for nearly 3 years, her name stitched neatly over her heart, her cleaning cart still parked beside the doorway where no one usually noticed it. She kept her hands folded in front of her apron, her breathing calm despite the weight of every eye in the room. Daniel Pierce, the company's chief operating officer, let out a quiet laugh that echoed louder than he intended. "Excuse me," he said with an amused smile that never reached his eyes. "Did our housekeeping staff just interrupt a billion-dollar acquisition?" A few nervous chuckles rippled around the table, more out of obligation than genuine humor. Naomi didn't react. She wasn't looking at Daniel. Her eyes never left Richard's coffee cup. Something about the faint shimmer around the paper lid had caught her attention only seconds earlier while replacing bottled water along the side counter. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have reminded themselves that it wasn't their place to speak. Naomi had almost done exactly that. Then she noticed a tiny streak along the edge where the lid met the cup, almost invisible beneath the warm light. It wasn't the color that unsettled her. It was the pattern. A memory she had spent years trying to bury surfaced with startling clarity, one that made the tiny detail impossible to ignore. Richard slowly stood from his chair, still holding the untouched cup. His tailored charcoal suit fit him with effortless authority, and the room instinctively waited for his reaction. "Why shouldn't I drink it?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, almost curious. Naomi swallowed once before answering. "Because something isn't right." The silence grew heavier. Someone shifted uncomfortably in a leather chair. Another executive glanced toward Daniel, expecting him to end the awkward moment. Instead, Daniel folded his arms. "Mr. Whitmore," he said confidently, "I think we're wasting valuable time. She's a maid, not a security consultant." Richard looked down at the cup again, then back at Naomi. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was only quiet certainty behind her eyes, the kind that couldn't easily be rehearsed. Before he could ask another question, a sharp electronic tone exploded through the room. One beep became 3, then dozens. Red emergency lights flashed along the ceiling. Magnetic locks slammed into place throughout the executive floor with heavy metallic clicks that echoed through the building like rolling thunder. Every phone vibrated simultaneously. A calm automated voice replaced the silence. "Attention! Security protocol initiated. Executive-level lockdown in progress. Please remain where you are until further instructions." No one moved. The emergency doors remained sealed, the flashing red lights washing over polished marble floors and glass walls that had always represented certainty and control. Richard Whitmore slowly placed the untouched coffee cup back onto the conference table without taking his eyes off Naomi Brooks. She stood exactly where she had been a moment earlier, shoulders relaxed, hands folded neatly in front of her apron, almost disappearing against the quiet elegance of the executive floor. That had always been her place. People remembered the spotless windows, the gleaming conference tables, and the fresh coffee that somehow appeared before every important meeting. They rarely remembered the woman who made those things happen. Naomi preferred it that way. Every morning she arrived before 5 o'clock, long before the first executive stepped through the revolving doors. While the city outside slowly woke beneath soft Midwestern sunlight, she pushed her cleaning cart through silent hallways, replacing flowers, polishing brass railings, and straightening chairs that would soon hold people whose decisions shaped thousands of lives. She greeted security officers by name, asked receptionists about their families, and quietly left homemade blueberry muffins in the break room every Friday, because she knew the overnight staff rarely had time for breakfast. Most employees smiled politely before hurrying past her. Some never looked up from their phones. Daniel Pierce usually walked by without acknowledging her existence at all. None of it ever seemed to bother Naomi. Her grandmother had raised her to believe that character was measured by what people chose to do when nobody was watching. That lesson stayed with her long after life became more complicated than either of them had imagined. Years earlier, before hospital bills and family responsibilities changed everything, Naomi had worn a different uniform. She had spent nearly a decade inside a United States Navy laboratory where every unusual stain, unfamiliar odor, and microscopic detail could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. She had learned that danger rarely announced itself with loud alarms. More often, it arrived disguised as something ordinary, something people trusted without question. She loved the work because it demanded patience instead of attention, discipline instead of applause. Then her husband became seriously ill, and every promotion she had earned suddenly mattered less than being home. Medical appointments replaced research projects. Savings disappeared one invoice at a time. After he passed away, the career she had built no longer fit the life she had left. She sold their house, moved into a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago, and accepted the first steady job she could find. Housekeeping did not require anyone to ask about the years missing from her resume or why someone with advanced technical training was polishing conference tables instead of leading laboratories. It simply offered honest work and dependable paychecks. Naomi never complained. She reminded herself every morning that dignity did not come from a job title, but from the way a person carried it. As the emergency lights continued to pulse across the boardroom, several executives whispered anxiously among themselves while checking phones that no longer had outside service. Richard remained silent, his attention drifting from the untouched coffee cup back to Naomi's composed expression. For the first time since she had begun working inside Whitmore Global, he was no longer seeing only the housekeeping uniform. He was looking at the woman wearing it, and something about the quiet confidence in her eyes suggested there was a story no one in that building had ever bothered to ask about. The automated announcement faded, leaving only the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of elevator motors frozen somewhere below the executive floor. Outside the towering windows, helicopters drifted across the bright Chicago skyline, while traffic continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside the boardroom, however, time itself seemed suspended. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside his chair, one hand resting lightly against the polished conference table. At 62 years old, he had built Whitmore Global Industries from a struggling manufacturing company into one of the largest infrastructure firms in the United States. Newspapers called him visionary. Business magazines praised his discipline. His employees respected his relentless standards, even if they rarely saw him smile. Every major decision passed through his office. Every acquisition carried his signature, and every person sitting around the table understood that a single sentence from Richard could reshape careers overnight. Across from him stood Daniel Pierce, nearly 20 years younger, impeccably dressed in a tailored Navy suit that reflected the same polished confidence he carried into every meeting. Daniel had earned a reputation as the company's sharpest negotiator. Investors admired his aggressive strategy. Financial news channels regularly predicted that he would eventually succeed Richard as chief executive officer. He enjoyed that speculation far more than he admitted. Daniel believed successful companies were built on authority, speed, and absolute control. To him, every employee existed within a carefully ordered hierarchy, and anyone stepping outside that invisible structure threatened the system itself. That belief explained the irritation still visible across his face as his eyes settled on Naomi. In his mind, the lockdown was an unfortunate coincidence that had given far too much attention to someone whose responsibilities should have ended with replacing coffee cups and dusting conference tables. He straightened his jacket before speaking with calm confidence. Mr. Whitmore, security protocols can be triggered for dozens of reasons. There is no reason to assume they have anything to do with this situation. Several executives nodded cautiously, grateful that someone had finally spoken. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the untouched cup sitting exactly where he had left it. Only moments earlier it had been another ordinary detail in an ordinary meeting. Now it had become the center of every thought inside the room. Daniel continued, sensing the silence working against him. We are about to finalize the largest merger in company history. We cannot allow panic or superstition to derail months of negotiations. The attorneys quietly exchanged uncertain glances while financial analysts scrolled through locked tablets that no longer connected to company servers. Nobody seemed willing to challenge Daniel directly, yet nobody looked completely convinced either. Richard slowly walked around the conference table until he stood only a few feet from Naomi. She remained composed despite the extraordinary attention now focused entirely upon her. Most people placed under that kind of scrutiny would have rushed to explain themselves or searched desperately for reassurance. Naomi did neither. She simply waited. Richard studied her expression carefully. It was not fear he saw. It was responsibility. That difference mattered. Miss Brooks, he said quietly. Before today, have we ever spoken? Naomi offered a respectful smile that carried no resentment. No, sir. Richard lowered his eyes briefly, almost embarrassed by the answer. 3 years. The woman had worked in his headquarters almost every weekday for 3 years, and he had never learned her name until she stopped him from drinking his morning coffee. Before another question could be asked, the conference room doors unlocked with a sharp mechanical click. They swung open immediately. For uniformed security officers entered first, followed by a tall man in a dark gray suit carrying a silver evidence case. The badge clipped beside his jacket identified him as Captain Ethan Cole, Director of Corporate Security. His expression was calm, but the seriousness in his eyes instantly erased whatever confidence remained around the conference table. Captain Ethan Cole placed the silver evidence case on the conference table with deliberate care before putting on a pair of blue protective gloves. No one spoke. Even Daniel Pierce remained silent, as every movement inside the room suddenly carried unusual weight. Ethan looked first at Richard Whitmore, then at the untouched coffee cup sitting beside the company's merger documents. Sir, he said calmly, at 8:23 this morning our monitoring center received an anonymous report indicating that someone intended to compromise a beverage scheduled for this meeting. We activated executive security protocol before we could verify the information. Richard frowned slightly. Why was I not informed immediately? Ethan answered without hesitation. Because we did not know whether the report was credible, and we could not risk alerting a potential suspect if one happened to be inside the building. The words settled heavily over the room. Several executives instinctively looked toward one another before quickly looking away again. Ethan carefully photographed the cup from several angles before examining the lid beneath a portable inspection light. The narrow white beam reflected across the smooth paper surface until it stopped on a tiny transparent streak barely visible to the naked eye. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Richard noticed it immediately. What is it? Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into the evidence case and removed a small testing swab along with a handheld analyzer no larger than a television remote. The room became so quiet that the faint ticking of an antique wall clock suddenly sounded unusually loud. Naomi Brooks remained near the doorway, watching without interrupting. She recognized every step Ethan was taking because she had performed similar examinations countless times years earlier. The sequence was methodical, careful, designed to eliminate assumptions before reaching conclusions. Daniel finally broke the silence with an impatient sigh. Captain, surely this is becoming excessive. Anyone could have spilled something while carrying the tray. Ethan glanced toward him politely, but continued working. Perhaps. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking softly. May I say something, sir? Richard turned toward her. Go ahead. She chose her words carefully. When I replaced the bottled water, the lid was already sealed. The streak was not spilled coffee. It was sitting exactly where the drinking opening locks into place. That is why I became concerned. Daniel folded his arms again. And how exactly would a housekeeper know the difference? A few uncomfortable faces turned toward Naomi, expecting embarrassment or hesitation. Instead, she answered with the same quiet composure she had carried all morning. Because I spent 9 years examining contamination patterns before I became a housekeeper. Nobody spoke. Daniel stared at her, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Richard slowly shifted his attention from Naomi back to Ethan, who had just inserted the completed test strip into the analyzer. A series of soft electronic tones filled the room, while a progress bar crawled across the small display. 10 seconds felt like several minutes. No one moved. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, casting bright ribbons of light across the conference table, yet the atmosphere inside remained cold and motionless. Ethan watched the screen without blinking. Then a sharp confirmation tone sounded. His eyes lifted slowly toward Richard. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He simply closed the analyzer, looked directly at the chief executive officer, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, preliminary results indicate that Miss Brooks had every reason to stop you from drinking that coffee. We are now treating this conference room as an active investigative scene, and until we identify exactly how this happened, everyone in this room is considered a potential witness." Captain Ethan Cole carefully sealed the coffee cup inside a transparent evidence container before handing it to one of his investigators. The simple motion carried more weight than any speech could have. Around the conference table, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Expensive suits no longer projected authority. Every executive understood that the meeting had transformed from a corporate negotiation into an official investigation. Richard Whitmore slowly pulled out his chair, but did not sit. His eyes moved across the faces of people he had trusted for years, searching for answers that none of them seemed able to provide. Daniel Pierce was the first to recover his composure. He straightened his tie and forced a measured smile. "Captain, with all due respect, a preliminary screening is not a final laboratory report. We should avoid unnecessary conclusions." Ethan nodded politely. "That is correct. Which is precisely why nobody will be leaving until we establish a complete chain of custody for every item brought into this room today." Security officers immediately began documenting laptops, briefcases, and catering supplies with quiet efficiency. No one protested. The atmosphere itself discouraged resistance. Richard finally turned toward Naomi. "Miss Brooks, tell me exactly what you noticed." She spoke slowly, making certain every word reflected only what she had personally observed. "When I replaced the bottled water, the coffee cup had already been placed beside your chair. The lid looked normal until the sunlight reached it from the east windows. That was when I noticed a thin, transparent film near the drinking opening. It reminded me of contamination indicators I used to examine years ago. I could not be certain what it was, but I knew I could not stay silent." Daniel let out a skeptical breath. Convenient timing. Several people glanced toward him. He continued before anyone could interrupt. "Think about it. She suddenly remembers specialized training after stopping the chief executive officer in front of the entire board. How do we know this is not part of a larger performance?" The accusation lingered in the air. Naomi did not answer immediately. She had experienced moments like this before, moments when suspicion arrived more quickly than trust. Instead of defending herself, she quietly reached into the pocket of her housekeeping apron and removed a small laminated identification card that had grown slightly worn around the edges. She handed it to Captain Cole without a word. Ethan examined the card carefully. His expression softened almost immediately. He passed it to Richard. It was an official United States Navy civilian laboratory credential bearing Naomi's photograph from years earlier. Below her name appeared a specialty designation in hazardous material analysis. Richard looked up slowly. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Naomi smiled gently. "Because this company hired me to keep the building clean, not to tell stories about the life I used to have." No one around the table seemed able to respond. Even Daniel remained silent for several long seconds. Before the quiet could settle completely, one of Ethan's investigators hurried back into the conference room, carrying a digital tablet. "Captain," she said, breathing steadily but with unmistakable urgency, "we reviewed security footage from the executive kitchen. The coffee service was interrupted for exactly 43 seconds during a camera outage at 8:11 this morning." Ethan accepted the tablet and watched the timestamp carefully. Richard stepped closer. "Was anyone identified?" The investigator shook her head. "Not yet, sir. But there is something else. The outage did not affect any other camera on this floor. Only the one facing the coffee station." The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt different. It was no longer driven by confusion. It was driven by realization. Someone had not simply taken advantage of an accident. Someone had planned every second with extraordinary precision, and that meant the person responsible likely understood the building almost as well as the people sitting inside it. The conference room gradually grew quieter as the first rush of questions faded into thoughtful silence. Security officers continued their work with calm precision, photographing every surface, collecting every object that might matter later, yet their movements seemed almost distant beneath the steady rhythm of the ventilation system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun climbed higher above Chicago, turning the glass towers across the river into mirrors of brilliant gold. Life beyond the building continued without interruption. Taxis crossed busy intersections. Boats drifted slowly along the water. Office workers carried coffee cups down sidewalks, completely unaware that an executive floor high above them had become the center of an investigation. Inside the boardroom, however, the mood had shifted from suspicion to reflection. Richard Whitmore stood beside the window with his hands resting lightly in his pockets, watching the city he had helped shape over 4 decades. For the first time in years, quarterly earnings, shareholder meetings, and acquisition contracts seemed strangely unimportant. His thoughts kept returning to a single realization that refused to leave him. 3 years. Naomi Brooks had walked these hallways before sunrise almost every weekday for 3 years. She had quietly prepared conference rooms, polished the very table beside which he now stood, and greeted employees with kindness that expected nothing in return. Yet until this morning, he had never asked her name. The thought settled heavily on his conscience. Not because he believed himself to be cruel, but because he suddenly understood how easy it was for success to make ordinary people invisible. Across the room, Naomi remained near her cleaning cart, which still stood exactly where she had left it when everything changed. A folded microfiber cloth rested neatly on the top shelf beside bottles of glass cleaner and fresh linens, ordinary tools that now looked almost symbolic against the polished elegance surrounding them. She quietly straightened one towel that had slipped slightly from the cart without realizing she was doing it. Old habits remained even during extraordinary moments. Captain Ethan Cole noticed the small gesture and allowed himself the faintest smile. Experience had taught him that character often revealed itself in the smallest actions. People under pressure usually abandoned routine. Naomi had not. She remained grounded in simple discipline, the same discipline that had given her the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. Richard slowly walked toward her until only a few feet separated them. Neither spoke immediately. Sunlight streamed across the marble floor between them, softening the sharp edges of the flashing emergency lights that still pulsed quietly overhead. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Miss Brooks, I have spent my career believing I understood the people who worked for this company." He paused, looking briefly at the housekeeping badge stitched above her heart. "Today I realize there are people I have been seeing every day without truly seeing at all." Naomi met his eyes with gentle sincerity. There was no anger waiting there, no satisfaction, only quiet compassion. "Sometimes people become busy carrying responsibilities," she said softly. "It does not always mean they stop caring. Sometimes they simply stop noticing." Her words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. No accusation, no bitterness, just a simple truth delivered with remarkable grace. Several executives lowered their eyes, each confronting private memories of receptionists, janitors, maintenance workers, and cafeteria staff whose names they had never learned despite passing them every day. Even Daniel Pierce remained unusually quiet, though his expression revealed more calculation than reflection. Captain Cole's phone vibrated once against his belt. He glanced at the incoming message, read only a few lines, and his calm expression immediately became more focused. He looked toward Richard with measured seriousness. "Sir," he said quietly, "the forensic laboratory has completed the accelerated analysis, and the results answer one question while raising a far more troubling one." Captain Ethan Cole lowered his phone and looked around the boardroom with the measured calm of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. Every conversation stopped again. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade beneath the weight of expectation. Richard Whitmore stepped away from the window. "Tell us," he said. Ethan nodded once. The laboratory confirmed that the residue on the drinking lid was not an accidental contaminant. It was deliberately applied. A wave of disbelief swept across the room. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The truth itself was loud enough. Richard slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment before asking the question everyone was already thinking. Was I the intended target? Ethan answered without hesitation. Based on the placement of the substance and the position of the cup beside your assigned seat. Yes, sir. The room fell completely silent. Several executives instinctively looked toward the empty chair where Richard had been sitting only minutes earlier. The untouched coffee cup, now sealed inside an evidence container, suddenly felt far more significant than the billion-dollar merger documents still spread across the polished table. Ethan continued. However, there is another development. He connected his tablet to the large presentation screen mounted on the wall. Security footage from the executive corridor appeared. The timestamp showed 8:11 in the morning. For 43 seconds, the camera overlooking the coffee station displayed only static. Then another camera from the opposite hallway appeared. Although it did not capture the coffee station itself, it clearly showed everyone who entered and exited the corridor during the outage. Ethan paused the recording. A single figure walked calmly away from the executive kitchen carrying a leather portfolio. Richard narrowed his eyes. That is not Daniel. Ethan shook his head. No, sir. Several executives leaned closer. The image sharpened as the investigator enlarged the frame. A familiar face slowly came into focus. The room seemed to lose its breath. It was Michael Grayson, Richard's longtime personal attorney and one of the company's most trusted advisors. He had attended nearly every board meeting for more than 15 years. He managed confidential contracts, supervised sensitive negotiations, and possessed unrestricted access to nearly every executive floor in the building. Daniel stared at the screen in genuine disbelief. That cannot be right. Ethan remained composed. Mr. Grayson left the building 12 minutes before the lockdown began. He also disabled the executive kitchen camera using administrative credentials that were assigned exclusively to the legal department. Richard looked at the image without speaking. He remembered countless late nights reviewing contracts beside Michael, celebrating successful negotiations, trusting him with decisions that affected thousands of employees. The betrayal was difficult to comprehend. Naomi quietly watched Richard's expression. She recognized it immediately. Sometimes discovering the truth hurt more than living with uncertainty. Ethan continued. We also recovered deleted electronic records from the camera control system. The authorization originated from Mr. Grayson's secure account. Federal authorities have already been notified. Richard slowly exhaled. Why would he do this? Ethan answered honestly. We do not know yet. Financial investigators are reviewing several transactions connected to offshore accounts created within the past 6 months. Another investigator entered the room carrying a sealed evidence envelope. Captain, she said, we found this inside Mr. Grayson's office safe. Ethan carefully opened the envelope and removed several printed contracts. Richard recognized the documents immediately. They were revised merger agreements scheduled for signature later that morning. But something was different. Entire ownership clauses had been quietly rewritten. If the meeting had proceeded as planned, control of Whitmore Global would have shifted. Through a hidden series of legal transfers that almost no one would have noticed until it was far too late. Richard looked from the documents to Naomi, realizing that her quiet decision to speak had done far more than protect one untouched cup of coffee. Without intending to, she had stopped an entire plan from unfolding, simply because she chose to trust her conscience instead of remaining invisible. The executive floor remained under restricted access for the rest of the afternoon, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that no security protocol could measure. The fear that had filled the room only an hour earlier had quietly given way to reflection. Investigators continued collecting documents while attorneys coordinated with federal authorities. Yet Richard Whitmore found himself paying attention to none of it. Instead, his eyes repeatedly drifted toward Naomi Brooks, who had returned to organizing the supplies on her cleaning cart as though the extraordinary events of the morning had never been about her. She carefully folded a fresh towel, straightened a bottle of glass cleaner, and quietly wiped a small fingerprint from the edge of the conference table. It was the same work she had planned to finish before sunrise interrupted the ordinary rhythm of her day. Richard walked across the room until he stood beside her. The executives noticed immediately. Conversations faded without anyone being asked to stop. Daniel Pierce watched silently from the opposite side of the table, his confident posture replaced by thoughtful restraint. Richard spoke clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Miss Brooks, there is something I need to say." Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the investigation. Richard took a slow breath. "For 3 years you worked inside this building while I walked past you without learning your name. Today you protected not only my life, but also this company and every family whose future depends on it. Yet the greatest mistake I made was believing that a person's value could somehow be measured by the title on an identification badge." No one interrupted him. The silence itself became a form of respect. Richard continued, "I owe you an apology, not because you demanded one, but because it is the truth." Naomi smiled gently. There was no trace of triumph in her expression. "Thank you, sir." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed his business card. On the back, he quietly wrote a direct phone number that only senior executives possessed. "I would like to offer you a position leading our corporate risk awareness program. Your experience, your judgment, and your integrity belong in the rooms where important decisions are made." Several executives exchanged surprised glances. It was an extraordinary offer. Naomi accepted the card respectfully, but did not immediately place it in her pocket. She looked at it for a long moment before raising her eyes again. "Mr. Whitmore, I am grateful for your confidence. But if I may ask for something else instead." Richard nodded. "Anything." Naomi glanced around the room, her eyes resting for a moment on reception staff standing quietly near the doorway, on the security officers who had worked without recognition all day, and on the maintenance employees waiting patiently in the hallway for permission to finish repairing the executive floor. "Learn their names," she said softly. "The people who clean your offices, protect your building, answer your phones, deliver your mail, and fix the lights before anyone notices they were broken. Most of them are carrying stories you have never heard. Sometimes all a person needs is to know they have been seen." Richard looked toward the employees she had mentioned. For the first time, he noticed the pride with which they wore their uniforms and the quiet professionalism that had kept his company running every single day. He slowly folded the business card back into his pocket. "Then that will be where we begin." Even Daniel lowered his head slightly, recognizing that no financial report or executive strategy session had taught him as much about leadership as one quiet housekeeper had taught in a single afternoon. Naomi picked up her cleaning cart once more, offering everyone the same warm smile she had given them every morning, proving once again that true strength never needed applause because it revealed itself most clearly through humility, grace, and the simple decision to do what was right when no one expected it. 1 week later, the executive floor looked exactly as it always had. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows, illuminating polished marble, freshly cleaned glass, and the familiar skyline stretching across downtown Chicago. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying laptops and paper cups filled with coffee, conversations blending into the steady rhythm of another busy workday. To anyone walking through the front entrance, nothing appeared different. Yet the people inside the building knew something had quietly changed. Richard Whitmore had introduced a new tradition at the beginning of every Monday leadership meeting. Before discussing profits, contracts, or quarterly projections, every executive spent 5 minutes meeting employees whose work usually happened beyond the spotlight. Receptionists, custodians, maintenance technicians, cafeteria workers, security officers, and mailroom staff were invited into the boardroom not to receive awards, but simply to be recognized as essential members of the company. The first meeting felt unfamiliar. By the second week, conversations became easier. By the third, executives were greeting people by name in the hallways instead of walking past with distracted expressions. Richard noticed that the culture of the company began changing in ways no strategic plan had ever accomplished. Respect spread quietly from one conversation to another. Naomi Brooks continued arriving before 5 o'clock every morning, just as she always had. She still pushed the same cleaning cart through silent corridors while the city slowly woke outside. She still polished conference tables until they reflected the morning light and carefully arranged fresh flowers in the reception area before the first visitors arrived. The work itself had not changed. What had changed was the way people looked at her. Security officers greeted her with warm smiles. Attorneys paused to ask how her weekend had been. Young interns who had never spoken to her before now thanked her when they passed in the hallway. Daniel Pierce changed as well. One morning, He quietly approached Naomi while she was replacing coffee supplies in the executive lounge. He hesitated for a moment before extending his hand. "Miss Brooks," he said sincerely, "I judged you by your uniform instead of your character. I was wrong." Naomi accepted his handshake with the same gentle kindness she had shown everyone else. "We all have opportunities to become better," she replied. "What matters is what we choose after we recognize them." Daniel nodded silently. There was nothing more to say. Later that afternoon, Richard walked through the lobby on his way to an investor meeting. As he passed the reception desk, he noticed Naomi helping a new employee find the correct elevator. She smiled, pointed him in the right direction, and returned to arranging a vase of white lilies beneath the company logo. Richard paused for only a moment. "Good morning, Naomi," he said warmly. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Richard." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, and somehow it felt completely natural. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. Richard continued toward the elevators while Naomi returned to her work. Sunlight reflected across the spotless floor, carrying their quiet reflections side by side for a brief moment before they separated in different directions. The building remained filled with important meetings, ambitious plans, and difficult decisions. But those who worked there never forgot the morning when the quietest voice in the room became the one that mattered most. And long after the investigation ended, people remembered something even more valuable than the mystery itself. They remembered that dignity is never determined by a title, a paycheck, or the color of a person's skin. It is revealed by the courage to do what is right, even when no one expects the person standing quietly in the background to change the story for everyone.